Hello, so we're going to have a look at the impact of a minimum price on producer and consumer surplus. So to start off with, we'll recap what we mean by producer and consumer surplus and use a diagram to help us out. So if we just construct a simple demand and supply diagram, labelling our axes. And when we're looking at producer and consumer surplus, it's really useful to make sure our supply and demand curve intersect our vertical axis or y-axis, our price axis. So make sure that happens because it's really easy then to demonstrate the particular areas that we are talking about. So let's label our market equilibrium, price and quantity. So let's label our first area. So we're going to label the consumer surplus in green. And basically it's the green triangle that I've just highlighted. That is the consumer surplus. And the reason why that is the consumer surplus is because there are a number of consumers who are willing and able to pay more than the market price of P. So we can see here that the market equilibrium is Q. And obviously the market equilibrium price is P. But we can see where my finger's pointing now, we can see above that price P, there are consumers who are willing and able to buy at a higher price, and obviously they're benefiting from the market equilibrium price being P. And what the consumer surplus does is it represents all those people who are willing and able to pay a greater price than the current market price, because obviously they are benefiting from the market price being at P. Okay, so now let's have a look at the producer surplus. So the producer surplus is this blue triangle here, and just hatch that in there just to demonstrate the producer surplus. And again, what we see, the reason why that is the producer surplus. So down here, for example, at a lower price, we have producers who are willing and able to sell at a lower price than the market equilibrium price of P. And obviously those producers who are willing and able to sell at a lower price than P are obviously benefiting, because obviously the price that they're receiving is far greater than what they would be willing and able to sell at. And obviously the producer surplus therefore represents all those producers who are willing and able to sell at a lower price than the price that's actually received within the market. So let's have a look now at how a minimum price impacts upon both consumer and producer surplus. So to start off with, we will construct our minimum price diagram, labeling our axes first of all, price and quantity. Again, remembering to make sure our supply and demand curve intersect the vertical axes to ensure we can demonstrate quite clearly the producer and consumer surplus. Let's now put in our market equilibrium of P and Q. We're now going to introduce our minimum price. We'll label that minimum price, and we'll label that P min. Okay, and we'll add in our quantities here. Quantity demanded of Q1 and a quantity supplied of Q2. Okay, so let's have a look now at producer and consumer surplus. So let's start off with, first of all, with consumer surplus. So we said that consumer surplus obviously relates to the idea that there are a number of consumers who are willing and able to pay a greater price than that one that is charged in the market. So we can see here in our diagram that the consumer surplus has considerably decreased, because what we now see is that the price charged in the market is P min, and therefore the number of consumers who are willing and able to pay that higher price of P min has considerably decreased and is now this green triangle here. So I've hatched that in green there. And we know that it is because when we draw our minimum price, we draw the quantity Q1, which represents the quantity demanded by consumers at that given price of P min. Right, so let's have a look at producer surplus, and we're going to highlight this in blue. So actually what we're going to do is we're going to go vertically down Q1, and then we're going to go down to the y-axis and then go back up and across, and then we're going to hatch in that area there. Okay, so this blue area that I've just put in is the producer surplus. The reason why the producer surplus is extended vertically is because obviously the producers are now receiving a higher price for their product. The price that they are receiving has gone from P to P min, so obviously the producer surplus therefore would extend vertically. You may be wondering, why has it not extended laterally, horizontally, to the right? Okay, the reason why it hasn't extended to the right is because obviously consumers are only demanding a quantity of Q1, and therefore any quantity produced above Q1 is not being sold, and therefore producers are therefore not benefiting, because obviously the product, if they produced the product, it wouldn't be sold, and therefore they wouldn't gain any benefit from that. So the reason why it doesn't extend, the producer surplus doesn't extend to the right, is because consumers are only demanding a quantity Q1. If consumers aren't buying it, well then the producers aren't going to sell it, and therefore there wouldn't be no benefit. So what we're going to label this triangle then is we're going to label this triangle that we've just been referring to, we're going to just draw around that in black, we're going to hatch that off, and we're going to describe that as the welfare loss. And the reason it is a welfare loss is because, well, this top triangle within the welfare loss, well, that previously used to be part of consumer surplus, but obviously consumers aren't willing and able to buy as much now because of the raising price from P to P min, and producers aren't going to produce the products that if consumers aren't going to buy it. So therefore we see a welfare loss there, and the bottom triangle similarly relates to basically the exact same point I was just referring to, the idea that this was originally producer surplus. The reason it is no longer producer surplus is because obviously producers aren't going to be selling these products because consumers aren't going to buy them. So basically this whole black triangle here is welfare loss, and we better put some notes down just to make sure we clear what the areas we've highlighted are. So the green area we said was consumer surplus, the blue area is producer surplus, and the black area was welfare loss. Just one point to touch upon, this area here that I'm just going around which is a square or rectangular area that I've just highlighted as a square there, that is part of the producer surplus, and remember the whole blue area is the producer surplus, but that particular square is a transfer from the consumer to producer surplus. To consumer. So obviously before the minimum price, this square area there was previously part of the consumer surplus, but obviously the higher price now means that consumers are less willing and able to buy at that given price, of P min, but consumers are receiving a higher price. So what happens is that is transferred from consumer to producer surplus, and therefore that's a transfer. This black area isn't transferred because obviously consumers aren't wanting the product. They aren't willing and able to buy that given product at that given time at the price of P min, and therefore the product isn't going to be sold, and therefore there is no transfer from consumer to producer and vice versa, because obviously products aren't being wanted and therefore not being sold, and that's why therefore that black area is a welfare loss. So just to highlight the key points here with regard to the impact of a minimum price on consumer and producer surplus. Obviously the main impact is obviously that consumer surplus falls and that producer surplus rises, and there is a welfare loss to society, also known as a deadweight loss. The two phrases are interchangeable. So those are the key things to remember. A minimum price would decrease consumer surplus, increase producer surplus, and lead to a welfare or deadweight loss. Now, it's really important that we consider to what extent these changes will occur, and does it differ depending on the scenario. So we're going to evaluate the impact of a minimum price on producer and consumer surplus now. So the first point to consider is where the minimum price is set. Okay, so in order to elaborate on this evaluative point, we're going to use some diagrams to help us out. So obviously, first of all, we're going to consider whether the minimum price set is higher, and we're going to use, as I said, we're going to use a diagram to help us demonstrate our point. So label our axes, price, quantity, add in our supply and demand curves, SD, label our equilibrium, PQ, we'll add in our minimum price. If we're going to look at make it higher, we're going to make it really, really high. So we're going to go really close to the top. Okay, and we'll label that minimum price. And we'll label that P min. And we'll add in our quantities. And we'll label that Q1. We'll label this Q2. Okay, so we've got our first diagram there. Where is the minimum price set? And we've gone for a really high minimum price. And when we talk about a really high minimum price, we're talking about making it as far away as possible from the market equilibrium price P. Now let's compare that with a lower minimum price. And when we talk about lower minimum price, we're thinking about setting one just above the market equilibrium, the original market equilibrium. So again, we'll draw a diagram to help explain our point. So label the axes, price, quantity. We'll add our supply and demand curve in. Supply, demand, price, quantity, and we'll set, as I said, we'll set it just above the market equilibrium, and we'll label that P min, and we'll label our quantities Q1 and Q2. Right, so we've got our two diagrams, and this clearly shows a minimum price which is set far greater than the original market equilibrium, and this diagram here shows a minimum price which is just set slightly above the market equilibrium, the original market equilibrium. And obviously we can elaborate on how this impacts upon producer and consumer surplus. So obviously the higher the minimum price from the original market equilibrium, we have a larger welfare loss. And that is obviously in comparison to the lower minimum price. So here we have a smaller welfare loss. And we can quite clearly see that on our diagrams, because if we highlighted the welfare loss in black, as we had done on our previous diagram, we see here that the welfare loss is significant. It's very large, isn't it? Whereas on this diagram, the welfare loss would only be that small triangular area there. So we can quite clearly see the higher the minimum price, the larger the welfare loss. Whereas if the lower the minimum price, the smaller the welfare loss. And then we can look at some other points to consider. So let's consider the consumer surplus. So we can quite clearly see here on our diagram that the consumer surplus is very, very small. So the higher the minimum price, the smaller the consumer surplus. Obviously, the consumer surplus has decreased, but overall, the relative size of it is far smaller the higher the minimum price. And we'll just highlight that area in green, and you may be struggling to actually see that because it is a very, very tiny consumer surplus. Whereas over here, if the minimum price is set a little bit lower, actually the consumer surplus has decreased, but is a little bit larger. Okay, so we can compare the two. Actually, we have a larger consumer surplus. When we say larger, obviously we're again remembering that consumer surplus has decreased, but the extent to which it decreases by, as we've just discussed the evaluation, it depends on where the minimum price is set. So the lower the minimum price, the larger the consumer surplus, and therefore the smaller decrease in consumer surplus. Whereas over on here, we can see a very small consumer surplus because the minimum price has been set significantly higher, and therefore there will be a larger reduction in consumer surplus. And then finally, we can consider the impact upon the producer surplus. What we see here is the larger the minimum price, the smaller the producer surplus. And over on the opposite side, when we've got a relatively low minimum wage in comparison, low minimum price in comparison to the market equilibrium, we have a larger producer surplus. Okay, so the impact upon these on the consumer and producer surplus are very much dependent upon where the minimum price is set. So just to recap, if the minimum price is set considerably higher than the market equilibrium, we will have a much larger welfare loss, we'll have a much smaller consumer surplus and a smaller producer surplus. Whereas if the minimum price is set quite close to the original market equilibrium, we will see a smaller welfare loss, we will see a larger consumer surplus, bearing in mind that obviously the consumer surplus has fallen, but not by as much, and we would obviously see that there would be a larger producer surplus with a minimum price set closer to the market equilibrium in comparison to a higher minimum price. And obviously we can just highlight the producer surplus area on our diagram to visually represent what we mean by the points we've just made. So there we go, really strong evaluation there. And we'll just consider the final evaluation point with regards to minimum pricing, and we're obviously going to consider the price elasticity of demand and how that impacts upon producer and consumer surplus. And again, we're going to draw diagrams to support us here. So first of all, price inelastic we'll consider on this side. Draw our diagram to support us. PQ. Remember to draw a nice steep demand curve. Introduce supply curve. We're making sure to set our minimum price. Label the curve minimum price, P min, we'll label our original market equilibrium, PQ, we'll add in our quantity demanded, at Q1, we'll add in our quantity supplied, at Q2. Okay, and then we will draw our price elastic demand curve. So we'll draw the diagram for this. Price, quantity, draw a nice shallow demand curve. Add in our supply curve. And then we'll add in our minimum price. Minimum price. We'll add in P min there. We'll add in P for our equilibrium and Q, and then we'll add in our Q1 and we'll add in our Q2. Okay, so what we can quite clearly see here is we can see some significant points. So with regards to the PD, if the PD of our product is price inelastic, then what we will see here is we will see a smaller welfare loss. So if it's price inelastic, we'll see a smaller welfare loss in comparison to if it is price elastic. And obviously we can highlight with the hatched area in our diagram. So that's that. I'll just actually colour that in black to make it easy to see. And here we can see our welfare loss is this area here. Obviously this, with its price elastic, the product, there'll be a larger welfare loss. And then we can consider the impacts upon producer and consumer surplus. So we can quite clearly see that with regards to the impact upon consumer surplus, we see a smaller decrease in consumer surplus in this scenario when the price elasticity of demand is price inelastic. So there's a smaller decrease in consumer surplus, whereas in this, when it's price elastic, there'll be a larger decrease in consumer surplus. And we can highlight the consumer surplus in green, like so. So you can quite clearly see it when it's price inelastic. There is still quite a considerable chunk of consumer surplus still available. So actually the decrease in the consumer surplus hasn't been that significant. Whereas if it's price elastic, the product, the decrease in consumer surplus has been very significant, because we're actually only left with a very small consumer surplus at the very end. And then finally, the impact upon the producer surplus. What we see is we see that there has been a larger increase in the producer surplus with regards to a product that is price inelastic. And we'll just shade that in blue. Because what we can see here is we can see that this blue square, which is ultimately, that I've just coloured in actually, so I'll just colour it in just for visual effect. So that blue square that I've just coloured in, we can compare that blue square to the area that I'm just scribbling in now on the price elastic one. So what we can see here is we can see quite clearly that if the product is price inelastic, the actual increase in relative to the previous producer surplus is actually far greater here. So let me just reiterate that point again. The increase in the producer surplus, if the product is price inelastic, is relatively larger in comparison to the previous producer surplus. Whereas, if we can consider the product to be price elastic, what we would see is we would see a smaller increase in producer surplus relative to the original producer surplus. So smaller increase in producer surplus. And maybe that's a point we should make a note of when we're referring to the smaller decreases in consumer surplus and the larger increase in producer surplus, and the larger decrease in consumer surplus and the smaller increase in producer surplus. We should make that point that it is relative to the original relative. Yeah. So these points here are all relative to the original producer and consumer. Relative to the original producer and consumer surplus. So just to recap the main points here, the consumer surplus falls with regard to a minimum price being imposed, producer surplus rises, and unfortunately there is a welfare loss to society. And the reason for that was because obviously the higher price means consumers are less willing and able to buy the given product at that given price point of P min at that particular time, and as a result, if consumers aren't buying it, then producers aren't going to be able to sell their products, and therefore we have this welfare loss highlighted in black. We argued that the extent of the impact on producer and consumer surplus are dependent on two key points: where the minimum price is set and also the price elasticity of demand. We argued that obviously the higher the minimum price was, the larger the welfare loss, the smaller the consumer surplus would be, and the smaller the producer surplus would be. And obviously the opposite would be true if the minimum price was closer. And when we said lower, we were talking about being closer to the original market equilibrium. And then obviously when we consider the price elasticity of demand, if the product is price inelastic, we would expect to see a smaller welfare loss, a smaller decrease in consumer surplus, and a larger increase in producer surplus. And that's relative to the original producer and consumer surplus. And obviously when we're doing this, when we're talking about it being smaller and larger, this is in comparison to a product that is price elastic. Thank you very much for listening.